Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in session number 2 of our new series entitled Cumulative Trauma and the QME, and I have a fascinating program for you today, one that I'm certain is going to help you in your very next case, because your very next case is certain to involve or include an allegation of cumulative trauma. And I want to go over several issues with you today and several concepts that will help you when it comes time for you to wrap your mind around many of the difficult determinations that are required of you as a qualified medical evaluator in these specific species of cases that seem to be very, very difficult for qualified medical evaluators. And before we get into the topics of today's discussion, let's just review what we learned in our last session. In our last session, we started to build our foundation for our understanding of cumulative trauma injuries. And we talked about what is the difference between first aid treatment and actual injury treatment in the California workers' compensation system. And once we identified what actually constitutes the difference between first aid treatment, which does not qualify as an industrial injury, versus those situations that do qualify as an industrial injury, that understanding began with our clarification of our understanding of what actually constitutes an injury in the California workers' compensation system. And central to the understanding of injury is that before we can have an injury, and let's back up even further, before we can have an industrial injury, we must first have an injury. And then the determination becomes whether or not the injury is related to the workplace activities. So before we have an industrial injury, we must first have an injury. Before we have an injury, we must first have a condition. A bona fide, symptomatic, diagnosable condition. The examinee has to actually be suffering from some sort of a condition. Before there can be an injury, there must be a condition. Before there can be an industrial injury, there must first be an injury, and an injury is based first and foremost on the examinee presenting to us with some condition that's symptomatic, that's diagnosable. Many examinees come to us for an evaluation completely asymptomatic. They have no condition. They have normal physical examinations. They have no limitations to activities of daily living. And when there is an absence of a condition, a diagnosable condition, there can be no industrial injury, and therefore there can be no industrial injury. On the other hand, when the examinee does present to us with a bona fide symptomatic diagnosable condition, then our work begins in determining the nature of the injury and in determining whether or not that injury is related to the workplace activities. Okay? So a condition is central to the whole topic of cumulative trauma injury claims. And then once we identify an injury, which is a condition that causes either work disability and or a need for medical treatment, once we have identified an actual injury, then the determination boils down to whether or not that injury can be traced to a specific incident of injury, or whether the injury qualifies as a cumulative trauma injury, which is due to repetitive physically or mentally traumatic activities extending over a period of time, which cause, number one, work disability, and or number two, a need for medical care. So that was what we talked about in our first session in terms of laying down the foundation for understanding the concepts of cumulative trauma injuries. In today's session, I want to continue to expand on those ideas by going into issues related to the date of injury for specific injury claims, which is described under Labor Code 5411. And I want to contrast that with the date of injury for cumulative trauma injury claims, which is uniquely defined in Labor Code 5412 And there's some concepts related to the date of injury related to cumulative trauma injury claims that are going to be critical for you to understand, because the whole universe of cumulative trauma claims revolves around nuances, subtleties, and loopholes in the legal definition of the date of injury for cumulative trauma claims. So we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the date of injury for cumulative trauma claims. And then we'll talk about what Labor Codes 5400 through 5403 have to say about how the examinee's responsibility is formulated in reporting an incident of either specific injuries and or incidents of cumulative trauma injuries. And it's clearly defined in law what constitutes a proper reporting of an industrial injury. But of course, like it seems every single one of these labor codes and codes of regulation, there are loopholes and there are little seams through which many of these claims that would otherwise seem to be claims that would not qualify for industrial injury, there's loopholes through which many claims can squeeze and can actually end up qualifying as an industrial injury. And then all of these topics are going to lead into our introduction today of the post-employment cumulative trauma injury claims. And as we're going to see, because cumulative trauma claims many times involve a delay, a long delay in reporting of the injury, many times the injury is not actually reported until long after the employee has separated his or her relationship from the employer. So the first reporting of the injury comes when the employee has long terminated or separated from the employer. So this delay in reporting gives rise to the whole universe of the post-employment cumulative trauma claims, of which you're going to see many of these particular claims in the evaluations that you're assigned. And these claims have a very specific handling, and I'll share with you how to arrive at accurate opinions and conclusions in those cases that involve the post-employment filing of a claim for industrial cumulative trauma injury. Okay, so let's begin today's discussion by reviewing some issues related to the date of injury for specific injury claims and also for cumulative trauma injury claims. Now, as a preface to our discussion about the date of injury for both specific and cumulative trauma injury claims, let me just make a couple comments about cumulative trauma injuries in general and cumulative trauma claims in general. It's my opinion that we as qualified medical evaluators should focus 70% of our efforts in learning more and learning how to better understand cumulative trauma injury claims. Specific injury claims, on the other hand, are very easy to handle. They're very easy to understand because they usually involve a definite beginning point and a definite ending point, whereas cumulative trauma injury claims are not clear on either end of the spectrum. So cumulative trauma injury claims are much more complex claims for us as qualified medical evaluators to handle, and cumulative trauma injury claims are coming at us in droves and waves. And so it's critical that we as qualified medical evaluators understand how to handle cumulative trauma injury claims and bring these claims to a full resolution in the resolving of the disputed issues. So before we get into issues related to the date of injury for these claims, let's just review some general principles about why cumulative trauma injury claims are so critical for us as qualified medical evaluators. Number one, the proportion of claims involving an allegation of cumulative trauma has increased sharply over the last 5 years, and I want to share with you some data regarding that. So Because the proportion of claims involving cumulative trauma is increasing, we're going to be seeing these cases. Therefore, we need to focus our attention on understanding these cases and understanding the issues involved in resolving these cases. Now, cumulative trauma claims have a long delay between the injury occurrence and the time of filing of the claim. And we're going to talk about the statute of limitations for cumulative trauma injury claims, which for all intents and purposes, there is none. So a claim for cumulative trauma injury can be filed a week after the injury occurrence, a month, a year, several years, a decade. There's seemingly no statute of limitations to when these claims have to be filed. So most of these claims involve some delay even into the post-employment period before the claim is actually filed, before the claim is initiated, before the examinee comes to us for a determination of issues. And I'm going to have some more information to share with you involving how long of a time period we can expect these cases to be delayed before they actually come to us for our evaluation. Now, also, cumulative trauma can have exposure over years or decades, but liability for cumulative trauma claims is generally spread over the last year of injurious exposure. So because of this exposure over years and decades, many times there's multiple insurers involved in claims for cumulative trauma. So when there's multiple insurers, the responsibility on us as Qualified Medical Evaluator doubles and intensifies because of the intense scrutiny that each of the insurers is going to have over the potential liability for the benefits of these particular claims. So these are claims that are going to be heavily scrutinized, and you can expect to receive multiple requests for supplemental reports, multiple depositions, as each of the parties attempts to sort out how much of the exposure they are particularly liable for. Further, cumulative trauma claims are more likely than specific injury claims, to involve multiple body parts. For that reason alone, these evaluations are much more complex than the evaluations involved with specific injury claims. The history is often much more complex. The examinee may have prior and relevant medical history related to at least some, if not all, of the alleged body parts. The physical examination on these examinees is much lengthier and much more detailed. Takes a much longer time, not to mention the reporting, the final reporting on multiple body parts makes these claims double, triple, quadruple complex as the reporting involved for specific injury claims. So it's critical that you as a Qualified Medical Evaluator learn to evaluate these cases quickly and accurately and arrive at opinions and conclusions expeditiously using a formulated set of algorithms and systems so that you can resolve disputed issues quickly and profitably for you as a Qualified Medical Evaluator. Cumulative trauma claims are more likely to involve representation by an applicant attorney, which means that they're more likely to involve representation also by a defense attorney or multiple defense attorneys because of the multiple insurers that are involved. So you can expect intense scrutiny on your opinions and conclusions just based on the sheer numbers of parties that are interested in the outcome of your determinations. Finally, cumulative trauma claims are more likely to include frictional costs, such as liens and medical legal costs. And for this reason, cumulative trauma claims are very, very expensive claims on the California workers' compensation system, and that's why they come to us for our determination on medical issues. Cumulative trauma injury claims are going to form the bulk of the cases that you're going to be called upon to evaluate as a qualified medical evaluator, and here are just a short list, but not a complete list, of some of the reasons as to why. Okay? So going back all the way to the beginning now, to the inception of these claims, let's talk about the dates of injury involved with specific injury claims and the dates of injury involved with cumulative trauma injury claims. Okay, so with regards to specific injury claims, the date of injury is relatively straightforward, but there are some nuances and some gray areas that lead to a great volume of work for us as qualified medical evaluators. So according to Labor Code 5411, which is the labor code that governs the date of injury for specific injury claims, Labor Code 5411 tells us that the date of injury, except in cases of occupational disease or cumulative injury, okay, so this accepts cumulative trauma injury claims out of this definition of date of injury, and the date of injury for cumulative trauma injury claims is described under another labor code, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So for specific injuries, the date is that date during the employment on which occurred the alleged incident or exposure, for the consequences of which compensation is claimed. So this would seem to be relatively straightforward for specific injuries, specific incidences of industrial injury. There's a defined date, there's a defined time upon which the injury occurred, for which the examinee or the employee is seeking compensation. It's relatively straightforward, correct? Well, some gray area arises with regards to the statute of limitations for the filing of a specific injury claim, and its exceptions and loopholes in the statutes that create cases for us as qualified medical evaluators that, like claims for cumulative trauma injury that are filed post-employment, specific injury claims can also be filed post-employment because of some gray areas in the statutes of limitation for the reporting and the filing of a claim for specific incidents of industrial injury. So let's talk briefly about that. Now, the statute of limitations for filing a specific injury claim is defined for us in Labor Code 5400. And Labor Code 5400 would seem on its surface to create a tight set of parameters within which these claims must be filed, which, if these claims are filed outside of these tight parameters, would bar these cases from moving forward. But I'm going to share with you some exceptions and some loopholes that do allow many cases, specific injury cases, to move forward. And we're going to see these specific injury cases in conjunction with our cases for cumulative trauma injury claims, because many times these claims for cumulative trauma injury have also a specific injury component attached to them, and the case can also be phrased in reverse as well, in that many of the cases that we receive which involve a specific incident of injury also have an allegation of a period of cumulative trauma injury as well. So it's critical for us to understand these concepts related to the date of injury and the requirements for reporting these injuries in both specific injury and cumulative trauma injury claims. So for specific injury claims, the Labor Code 5400 tells us, except, and there's always exceptions, and we'll talk about these exceptions under 5402 and 5403, especially 5402. It says, except as provided by sections 5402 and 5403, and it seems to me, what's the purpose of having a code, a 5400 code, when there's always exceptions? But this is the exact language of the law. It tells us, aside from these exceptions, no claim to recover compensation under this division shall be maintained unless within 30 days, here's the statute for the filing of a specific injury claim. It says within 30 days after the occurrence of the injury, which is claimed to have caused disability or death. We won't talk about death because I don't know about you, but I don't get a lot of death claims. And we'll scratch out the section here that relates to death, in the case of death. So within 30 days after the occurrence of the injury, which is claimed to have caused the disability and or the need for medical treatment, there is served upon the employer notice in writing signed by the person injured or someone in his behalf. So Labor Code 5400 puts the responsibility and the onus for reporting the injury on the injured person, the injured employee. And as we're going to talk about later on, the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury falls upon the employee, falls upon the examinee. And here is step one of the burden of proof, is that the reporting of the injury, the responsibility for that, is on the employee. And the employee must serve the employer in writing, at least under this code, and there are exceptions to this code which we'll talk about. And so for this reason, you can see that Labor Code 5400 puts tight brackets around the time period within which an employee can claim a specific incident of industrial injury. Of course, there are exceptions, but the purpose of it is to tightly bracket this time period. And how is it then that we get so many cases where an employee has filed a claim for a specific incident of injury months and even years after its alleged occurrence? There must be an exception to this 30-day reporting requirement. And the exception has to do not with the time, but the exception has to do with what constitutes notice. Now, in this particular code, Labor Code 5400, notice is very clearly defined as notice in writing, signed by the person injured or signed by someone in the injured person's behalf. This is a very specific and definite criteria which many employees do not meet or cannot meet. So how is it then that we see so many of these cases much later, that have been reported much later than 30 days after the alleged occurrence? And it has to do with one or more of these exceptions in these additional labor codes. Okay, so let's review Labor Code 5402. And as we go through this code, you're going to have an aha moment, and you're going to realize, oh, now I get it. Now I understand why I'm getting so many of these denied claims for both specific and for cumulative trauma injury allegations. And it all has to do with the exceptions found under Labor Code 5402. So 5402 creates a contradiction or a loophole under Labor Code 5400 as relates to notice, quote unquote notice, of the reporting of the injury. And here, Labor Code 5402 softens the rigid requirements under Labor Code 5400 of 30 days and of written notice served on the employer. Those are very rigid, and 5402 Section A softens those rigid requirements. Here, it tells us that knowledge of an injury obtained from any source, such as my wife, such as my child, such as my brother-in-law, such as a co-worker, from any source, on the part of an employer or on the part of the employer's managing agent, a superintendent, a foreman, or any other person in authority, or the knowledge even of the assertion of a claim of injury, which is sufficient to afford an opportunity to the employer to make an investigation into the facts, is equivalent to service under Section 5400. So 5400 told us that service or notice, the service of notice, requires a written notice signed by the employee, submitted within 30 days. A very tight requirement. But here, 5402 softens that requirement and tells us that no, you don't have to submit something in writing within 30 days. You can simply tell your coworker to tell the foreman that, hey, you injured yourself last Thursday. You can have your wife call in to the foreman and have your wife inform the foreman and give the foreman knowledge of an injury, or assert to the foreman that there was an injury last Thursday. Or you can have your wife, one source, call into not the supervisor, not the foreman, but you can have your wife call into human resources. You can have your wife call into payroll. You can have your wife call into the parent company. You can have your wife call into any person in authority to assert a claim for industrial injury, either specific or cumulative. This applies to both. And that's equivalent to service. So this is where the tight loophole under Labor Code 5402 is exploited. And this is why so many claims come to us, even in the post-employment situation, because the employee will tell you, and that will tell their applicant attorney, and the applicant attorney will claim to the claims payer that the employee informed or gave knowledge of an injury or asserted a claim of injury to the supervisor or to the foreman. And in the face-to-face evaluation, the employee will tell you, or the examinee will tell you, yes, I told my supervisor, but no medical care was provided. I told my boss, but they didn't give me a claim form. I reported the injury to my coworker who told the boss, but nothing was ever done. And it's this loophole under 5402A that brings us many cases for both specific injury claims and cumulative trauma injury claims. Now, many of these cases come to us, especially the post-employment types of claims, they come to us as denied claims. And Labor Code 5402 explains to us how and why these claims come to be denied in the first place. And it has to do with Sections B and Section C. Section B tells us if liability for the assertion of a claim is not rejected within 90 days after the date the claim form is filed under Section 5401, and we didn't review Section 5401, but Section 5401 talks about the employer's responsibility for providing the employee with a claim form. We didn't really talk about that, but it says that if liability is not rejected within 90 days, the injury shall be presumed compensable under this division. The presumption of this subdivision is rebuttable only by evidence discovered subsequent, meaning after, the 90-day period. The presumption cannot be rebutted by evidence that was available during the 90-day period, because that decision should have been made within 90 days. The presumption can only be rebutted by evidence that comes in after the 90-day period. But in the 90-day period, if the claim is not rejected, then it's presumed compensable. So typically, the employer or the claims administrator will perhaps spend some time, will spend 30 days or 60 days or sometimes even 90 days to investigate the claim before rendering their opinion to either accept or deny the claim. Now, the claims administrator cannot delay unfairly, because Labor Code 5402C defines their responsibility even during this 90-day period. It tells us that within 1 working day after an employee files a claim form, the employer shall authorize the provision of all treatment for all body parts for the alleged injury, and shall continue to provide that treatment until the date that liability for the claim is accepted or rejected. even up to 90 days. So the claims administrator, whether they accept or deny the claim, they're on the hook for medical treatment until they make such a decision to either accept or reject the claim. When they accept the claim, then the medical treatment continues underneath the claim, underneath the pot of money within the claim. If the claim is rejected, then there is no medical treatment provided, and the medical treatment that has been provided under this section is provided under the pot of money allowed under Labor Code 5402, which is limited to $10,000. So many times when these claims come in, the claims administrator simply denies the claim, rejects the claim here, thereby stopping the payment of medical treatment services, saving themselves up to $10,000 while they investigate the claim, such as having an evaluation by you as a qualified medical evaluator. So this is the provision here that gives the claims administrator the motivation to deny the claim. That's why we see so many claims denied, specifically for cumulative trauma injury claims, but also for specific injury claims. And that has to do with Labor Code 5402C and the desire of the claims administrator to stop the bleeding from the $10,000 and to give them time, free time, to make an investigation into the facts of the claim. So that's the date of injury for specific injury claims, which would seemingly on the surface under Labor Code 5400 to have very tight parameters and very tight requirements for the filing of a verified bona fide claim for industrial injury that by law should move forward. If those tight requirements can be met, the claim can move forward. But there are exceptions under Labor Code 5402 that bring us many cases as qualified medical evaluators, even post-employment types of claims for both specific and cumulative trauma injury claims. So that's one half of the universe of the claims that we see, particularly the denied claims, and especially denied claims that are filed post-employment. What about the cumulative trauma injury claims? Well, here is where the other half of the universe opens wide to create a flood of cases coming to us as qualified medical evaluators, and it has to do with a nuance in the language of the date of injury for a cumulative trauma injury claim. And this is described for us in Labor Code 5412, which tells us that the date of injury for a cumulative trauma injury claim is that date upon which the employee first suffered disability therefrom, first suffered disability from the injury, first suffered disability, which is work restrictions, total temporary disability, and or a need for medical treatment. And so that's the first criteria, when the employee first suffered disability. Now in cases of post-employment filing of cumulative trauma injury claims, many times the employee never suffered disability. They worked all the way up until their last date of employment, never suffered disability, never had any medically prescribed work restrictions, were able to work their full and unrestricted duties. So this criteria, disability, is not met. But by disability, we refer to either work restrictions or work limitations and or the need for medical treatment. And I have a couple of cases to share with you to illustrate those principles and those differences. And so that's criteria number one, is the date upon which the employee first suffered disability, and so this says and, it doesn't say or, it says and. So these two requirements are required, and either knew or in the exercise of reasonable diligence should have known that such disability was caused by his or her present or prior employment. So the employee can be suffering disability, can be undergoing medical treatment, but does not know does not know that the disability and or the need for medical treatment is caused by the present employment or even the prior employment. And the employee cannot learn this until much, much later, even after the separation from the employer in a prior employment situation. The employee doesn't learn this until much later when the employee is either probably informed by their medical provider, their primary treating physician or primary care physician, that, hey, the current symptoms that you're experiencing, the current need for medical treatment that you're suffering, the current disability that you're suffering, this is due to your workplace activities. And it's that point in time that the employee gains the knowledge that the disability that they're suffering is caused by their present or their prior employment. So these two factors have to coincide and collide. There has to first be disability, and then later there is the knowledge of the disability. It's where these two dates intersect is what determines the date of injury. So the great gray area here under this code, 5412, is the date of the knowledge. The date of the knowledge. Many times employees do not gain this knowledge for months, years, and even decades following their employment from one or more prior employers. So if that's true, what is the statute of limitations on the filing of these claims? We saw that for specific injury claims, the statute of limitations is 30 days, although there are exceptions to that. Well, with cumulative trauma, an employee can go on seemingly forever prior to gaining the knowledge. And this is what creates the situation in California workers' compensation, where these claims for cumulative trauma injury are filed many, many years, and there's a great delay in the filing of these claims long after the date of occurrence of the injury. And so this great delay is what brings these cases to us as qualified medical evaluators months and multiples of years after the alleged date of occurrence of the cumulative trauma injury. And according to a recent study by the Workers' Compensation Institute Review Board entitled The World of Cumulative Trauma Claims, it takes greater than 7 years for 98% of cumulative trauma claims to be reported. So this is a great delay, because it's not until sometimes many, many years later that the employee claims to have gained the knowledge that their disability was caused by the present or the prior employment. And this time frame, this delay of filing of cumulative trauma injury claims is up to 3 times as long as for specific injury claims. In other words, for specific injury claims, 98% of all claims come in much, much sooner, somewhat sooner than even 2 years after the reported date of injury. And as we said, that 2 years, we described where the allowance under Labor Code 5402 allows for a delay in filing of even specific injury claims. But certainly for cumulative trauma injury claims, there basically is no statute of limitations during which these claims must be filed. And here, this is a chart that depicts this. This is a chart that depicts the number of years until 98% of claims are reported. And you can see here at 7.4 years, it takes 7.4 years for 98% of all cumulative trauma claims to be reported. Whereas for non-cumulative trauma claims in California, the time frame is much, much less, roughly one-third the time, slightly over 2 years compared to 7.4 years. And California's reporting frequency, the timeline of reporting of California claims, pretty much mirrors the median state filing for all indemnity claims. you can see that these two graphs are roughly parallel, but it's the cumulative trauma injury claims that skews the graph for California all claims because of the great delay under which these claims for cumulative trauma can be filed. Now, as we stated in the beginning of today's discussion, the proportion of claims that involve an allegation of cumulative trauma injury has been increasing dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years. And according to a study, again by the Workers' Compensation Institute Review Board, the CT claim proportions started rising in 2008. Now remember, it takes many, many years for all of these claims to come in, so the statistics relating to these claims sometimes aren't fully known for many, many years. So the last reporting year for which we have fairly reliable statistics brings us up into around 2016, 2017. But in retrospect and looking back at CT claim proportions, we see that the graph started to rise around 2008. And the gap between CT claim proportions at earlier periods and later periods has widened. In other words, if we describe a reporting period as approximately 18 months, and we look at the number of claims that are filed at the 18-month period compared to the number of claims that are filed at later periods, such as a period of time 7.4 years later, the gap between those two graphs is widening, which indicates that more and more CT claims are being reported more and more later. And so here is a graph again from the WCRB that depicts that. This is the graph here that describes the reporting frequency at earlier claim periods. And you can see that around 2008, roughly approximately 8% of all claims had some allegation of cumulative trauma, and then later, once all the statistics were accumulated, the final proportion was roughly 10%. So there's a 2% gap. That 2% is the frequency of claims, or the proportion of claims that are reported later. Okay, so this is a graph. These are graphs that compare early reporting periods to late reporting periods. And as we approach 2014, 2015, and 2016, you can see that the gap between the graphs is increasing. So more and more of these claims are being filed later and later. And so this is what brings these cases to us, this late filing, this late reporting of claims. This is what brings these cases to us as qualified medical evaluators for our opinion on AOE and COE, as the claims adjuster goes through the claims denial process as we defined and described earlier under Labor Code 5402 in an effort to stop the bleeding from the $10,000. So doctors, isn't that fascinating? I hope this helps you at least gain some more insight as to why it is that we receive so many cases that require our opinions, and why we receive so many cases that are the denied cases for both specific and cumulative trauma injury claims. Now, if you think about it, we receive three basic types of claims. We receive claims that have an allegation of a specific incident of injury. We receive claims that have an allegation of cumulative trauma injury. And we have claims that involve allegation of a specific injury with a cumulative trauma component, or a cumulative trauma injury with a specific injury component. So two of the three involve cumulative trauma allegations anyway. And for both specific and cumulative trauma injury claims, because the statutes are so wide, they vary all the way from 30 days to as many as 7.4 years for 98% of cumulative trauma injury claims to be reported. The statute of limitations is so wide that the claims administrator really has no option but to deny these cases to stop the bleeding from $10,000 under Labor Code 5402, to allow the claims administrator an opportunity to investigate the claim, which involves partly our evaluation as a qualified medical evaluator. So these nuances and subtleties in the law are there in law to protect injured workers. There are scenarios where an injured worker is unable to provide in writing within 30 days written notice to the employer. I mean, imagine an injured worker who suffers an injury, who's hospitalized, who perhaps is in pretty bad shape and isn't able to provide to the employer notice in writing, but the injured employee can have his wife or his family member notify the employer and provide knowledge of the assertion of the claim, and that injured worker should have protection under law for California workers' compensation benefits. So these nuances and these loopholes are in the law to protect injured workers. The same thing applies to cumulative trauma and occupational diseases, where injured workers many times they don't gain the knowledge that the symptoms and the disability that they're currently suffering and the need for medical treatment that they're currently undergoing has to do with workplace exposures many, many years ago. I mean, think about an occupational disease such as lung cancer for somebody who worked in the coal mine, someone who worked in a dusty environment, someone who worked around asbestos. It's not until much, much later, because of the latency of many of these diseases, that the employee is going to require medical treatment, that the employee is going to suffer disability. So these languages in the labor codes that deal with the dates of injury are there to protect those injured during the course of their employment. And it's also this same language that brings us to many other claims that are denied by the claims administrator as suspicious claims, as claims for which the claims administrator seeks our opinion on the issues. So doctors, I hope this helps you, and I hope you go through these thought processes and these mental flow sheets with your very next evaluations that involve at least the denied claims, but also the cumulative trauma injury claims, whether denied or accepted claims. Now, in our next session, I want to talk to you about the specific species of the post-employment cumulative trauma claims, and we're going to dive deep into Labor Code 3600 to see what the law has to say about the filing of claims after the employment relationship has been terminated. And you're going to find this to be a fascinating discussion, because many of the cases, whether you recognize them or not, many of the cases that you're evaluating do contain an element of post-employment filing for an injury claim, either specific or more commonly a cumulative trauma injury claim. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. I look forward to being with you on our next discussion, as well as we continue with our new series entitled Cumulative Trauma and the QME. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.